Our third and final presenter is Ms. Rebecca Gookool, and she will speak on welfare considerations of the Economic Partnership Agreement, a CARIFORUM perspective. Ms. Gookool.
Session Chair, Mr. Martin Franklin, honoree of this year's COTE conference and former head of department, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I will be presenting briefly on some ongoing research which evaluates the welfare impact of the Economic Partnership Agreement on CARIFORUM economies. Generally, this is the format of my discussion this morning, and as you can see, this paper puts forward three complementary methodologies, each of which I will devote a couple minutes this morning to describing. They are the Greenaway and Milner 2004 model, the SMART model as per the World Integrated Trade Solutions software, and the Trade Reform Impact Simulation tool. I will present some preliminary comparisons among the various methodologies and some preliminary conclusions. Okay. The global trade landscape over the last few decades has dramatically changed in that, to date, over 2/3 of world trade occurs under the ambits of regional trading blocs. Now, in this new environment, and evaluating the impact of trade reform can take place either under a general equilibrium framework or partial equilibrium framework. A general equilibrium framework is a very comprehensive system which includes all of the stakeholders, all of the markets, and you can well imagine that a general equilibrium framework requires an extensive amount of data to run. In developing countries, access to that data is not as readily available, and as such, what the literature suggests is that for these types of economies, we use a partial equilibrium model. A partial equilibrium model is a model that zones in the analysis in terms of a specific market or a specific set of stakeholders rather than looking at the entire system. And for developing countries, there are, of course, benefits to using the partial equilibrium model. Each of the methodologies that has been applied in this paper is a partial equilibrium model, all right? And this type of framework allows us to evaluate what is the impact in import values or import trends, as well as tariff revenues. And for developing countries, trends in import and trends in tariff revenues, especially emanating from tariff reform, is something that's very critically linked to development, and that's important. And the partial equilibrium model allows us to do that. Now, needless to say, we are economists, so we use models, so just don't be scared. I'll just try to go as fast as possible with it. In the first instance, and this is the Greenaway and Milner 2003-2004 model, and as per the schema, you'd realize that this particular paper suggests that there are two streams of the partial equilibrium framework that has been applied. One, a perfect substitution assumption stream, and an imperfect substitution assumption stream. This particular stream assumes that the import sources are perfectly substitutable. So it implicitly says that a car that comes from Germany is exactly substitutable for a car that comes from Korea. Now, that is not the case, but we are going to build the model up using the basic assumptions, then adjust as we go along. So, in the first instance, the Greenaway and Milner system is fundamental to the understanding of the impacts of a change in trade policy. These authors, as I said, assume that there are two streams, a perfect substitution situation and an imperfect substitution situation. In this case, in the pre-economic partnership agreement, the total amount of imports that this country imports is 0M3, of which 0M1 comes from the regional partner, or CARICOM or CARIFORUM economies, and M1, M2 comes from the non-EU rest of the world. In the post-EPA environment, 0M3, a total of 0M3 comes from the EU. In this environment, or in the post-EPA environment, it addresses displacement of imports that would have come from the CARICOM environment. It identifies that there are some trade diversion, which is imports that would have come from the rest of the world, and trade creation, which is, of course, the increase in imports that come from demand. Apart from that, also, this basic model tells us or gives us an indication as to how tariff revenues are going to change, and this is represented on my very simple diagram, A and B. So what this particular model allows us to do is conceptually evaluate what is the differences or what has happened to imports by virtue of various sources, as well as tariff revenues. The imperfect substitution assumption, which is more reflective of reality, is premised on what is known as the Armington Principle, which says basically that demand for products is distinguished not only by their kind, but also from their place of production. And that's very, very important. In this particular stream, Greenaway and Milner identifies that while imports originally come from the partner country, which is the first panel, the non-EU rest of the world, the second panel, and the EU, the third panel, in the post-EPA period, there is a trade displacement effect among CARIFORUM economies. There is a trade diversion effect among the non-EU rest of the world, and there is a trade creation effect that emanates from the increase in demand of EU goods. Each of these models that I'm going to talk about today has an empirical part of it, in that each of these models allow you to calculate values of trade displacement, which has an economic implication that I will talk about, trade diversion, which has an economic implication that I'll also talk about, and trade creation. Now, the other methodology that was applied is the SMART model, which is found in the World Integrated Trade Solutions software. It is a model that was developed by UNTAD and the World Bank during the 1980s. And basically, this particular framework uses simulations, and it identifies that the trade diversion effect is a type of substitution effect. And for the students in the room, the substitution effect, as you are aware, is essentially a switch in goods that are relatively cheaper away from goods that are relatively more expensive. And in an environment with a tariff reduction, there is an effective fall in price of those goods which are so affected. So the trade diversion effect is likened to a substitution effect that you may be aware of in microeconomics. In terms of the way that WITS measures the trade creation effect on the second part of my panel, you would see that it is similar to an income effect, or the increase in imports in this case emanating from the fact that the price of the good has fallen, resultant from the reduction in tariffs. So this is basically the framework that underlies the empirics. SMART also allows us to determine what is the revenue impact. And in the first panel, it assumes that you do have a tariff. In the second panel, it assumes that the tariff has been reduced and what is the change in revenue emanating from that situation. In the context of the EPA, the assumption that we have used is that the tariff on EU goods has been reduced to zero, as per the pure sense of the model, pure sense of the agreement. The last model that has been applied in this paper is the TRIST, or the Trade Reform Impact Simulation Tool. It was developed by the World Bank in response to requests for a more detailed analysis of adjustment costs associated with tariff reform. The most immediate concerns that I started with a little bit earlier, especially for developing countries in these situations of trade reform, is their impact on revenue. Just consider, for example, the Caribbean economies, where just about 10 years ago, there was a high proportion of government revenues that were attributed to tariff revenues or came from tariff revenues. This particular tool is built not only to evaluate the impact of revenue changes emanating from tariff adjustments, which is what the WITS model allows you to do and the SMART model allows you to do, but this particular methodology also allows for the evaluation of VAT and excise taxes, because these are taxes in certain countries that are linked to imports at the border. TRIST can also be used to evaluate the impact on domestic production and employment levels if the commodity is produced domestically as well as imported. So this is basically the structure of TRIST. It assumes that the demand for the commodity is satisfied by domestic production as well as imports, and imports can come from various sources. As a result of this, the model is premised on several elasticities or substitution values, including the demand effect, an evaluation of how, this number essentially tells us how demand is switched from imports to domestic production in an environment of tariffs. And I just saw the time, so let's move quickly. Basically, this is also how TRIST works. There are a series of imports. There are a series of data that you put into an aggregation tool, and it runs an automatic simulation for you. So basic comparisons. The Greenaway and Milner model, SMART, and TRIST. Each one of these, and this is in particular to the imperfect substitution case for the Greenaway and Milner, based on the Armington Principle of imperfect substitution source, imperfect import substitution sources. The input data, 2-digit for Greenaway and Milner, 6-digit HIS for SMART and for TRIST. And this is basically a comparison of them. I must say at this point that SMART and TRIST are simulation tools, and the framework is provided for you. Milner and Greenaway is a manual tool. The inputs are given in the paper, and you actually have to run the details yourself. So some comparisons are working there. Some from our preliminary outputs, we see here that our numbers generally stack up comparatively to the researchers that have already contributed to this literature in the regional sphere. And this is with regards to the Milner and Greenaway framework. This one is with regards to the WITS framework, generally similar numbers in terms of what we found and what they found. With regards to the TRIST model, Lord and Allen did, which is the most up-to-date TRIST application for the Bayesian economy. There are some similarities in the values that we have gotten, but there are also some differences, and I can chat with you about that as we go along. This particular paper that we're doing, ladies and gentlemen, is novel in the sense that it adds to the landscape the comparison of each one of the three methodologies. What I've done here is have an average of SMART and TRIST results. Greenaway and Milner results are still outstanding because, as I said, it's a manual calculation and that is going to take time. But what we are seeing here is that in all cases, for all countries that are listed, there is a negative trade displacement effect. That is, trade is going to be diverted away from the regional context. There is going to be a trade diversion effect. Trade will be diverted away from the non-EU rest of the world, and trade creation is going to be positive with the EU. Note also that in all cases, for all countries, fiscal revenue in the EPA environment is going to fall for each country. So, general conclusions, because I'm very close to being out of time. The paper reviews the trade and fiscal impact of the Economic Partnership Agreement on CARIFORUM economies, utilizing three methods for evaluating the same. Though these results vary in terms of magnitude across the methods, the trends do point to the same conclusions. That is, that while trade with the EU is expected to rise, imports from the CARIFORUM region and the non-EU rest of the world is expected to fall. So why is that a problem? With particular reference to the likely fall-off in imports from CARIFORUM, the goal of the EPA, the actual agreement, is to encourage intra-regional trade, and that goal can be questioned, especially in the environment where your tools show that there is going to be a trade displacement effect. Regional development may be compromised if trade is diverted away from non-EU natural trading partners, and there's a whole literature on that in terms of the long-run economic implications. Each of the methods applied results in a fall-off in fiscal revenue for all the countries identified. It therefore means that other revenue-generating interventions need to be put in place in the medium to long term. And how is that done, or what is important for that? There needs to be local development production planning occurring in each economy. There must be a push towards the diversification of markets as a deliberate strategy of the region. And this is something that can be leveraged in that the agreement does provide facilities for aid for trade and development assistance, so that these funds should be better leveraged in terms of our access to them. And the development of the regional private sector must be a priority in terms of identifying and addressing those non-tariff barriers to entry to the EU market, and trade in niche services to the EU can be expanded. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much, and I'm available for the questions.